Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first session of the online colloquium, Pluralizing the Anthropocene, Re-envisioning the Future of the Planet in the 21st Century. My name is Gonçalo Santos. I'm a social anthropologist based at the Research Center for Anthropology and Health and the Department of Life Sciences at the University of Coimbra. I'm also the director of the International Research Network Sci-Tech Asia. I will be the moderator of this evening's session with none other than Team Ingold. Hi, Tim. Welcome to Serralves. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us, even if only virtually. Yeah. So before moving to a sort of more proper formal introduction of our distinguished guest, I would like to say a few contextualizing words about the background of this online colloquium. Pluralizing the Anthropocene is a project curated by myself and my colleague Ana Luisa Santos, an anthropologist specialized in the field of human evolution, based also at the Department of Life Sciences and the Research Center for Anthropology and Health at the University of Coimbra. The project is a partnership between the Research Center for Anthropology and Health and the Fundação de Serralves, together with the research network Sci-Tech Asia, the Center for Functional Ecology, Science for People and the Planet, the Department of Life Sciences of the University of Coimbra. I mentioned all of these highly diverse institutions with very long names because they sort of represent the arts, the humanities, and the sciences, and because I want to give you an idea of the multiplicity of voices involved in the backstage of this project. And this multiplicity of voices is also reflected in the diversity of voices in the audience here tonight. Serralves is a leading global cultural institution well known for its role in pioneering or in promoting inclusive debates in the larger civil society on topics that matter to everyone. And this colloquium is a wonderful example of this mission. More than 1,300 people registered for this talk alone, including people from many different walks of life and from many different countries and continents. I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for showing interest in this event. We have tried to choose time slots that allow the inclusion of people living in different time zones and parts of the world. But this was not always possible. And I would like to thank all participants in Asia, for example, who have joined us this evening for this session, despite the late night, early morning hours. When Ana Luisa and myself started thinking about this project many months ago, our goal was to create an open, multivocal, and international forum of debate on important issues that are not getting as much attention as they should. The world's attention is rightly focused on tackling a global pandemic that has proved far more deadly than initially predicted. But we also need to think about some of the underlying issues shaping the present epoch of increasing anthropogenic environmental uncertainties, of which the COVID-19 pandemic is only a byproduct. The world we live in is very different from that of our grandparents and great-grandparents. It's warmer, drier, more polluted, and if the trend continues, it is more than likely that the future generations will be facing a tough time. The current production and consumption system has brought many benefits to a large number of people and populations around the world, even if with significant inequalities. But it has also led to unprecedented levels of environmental destruction and to a conjuncture of global warming and climate change with increasingly visible effects. The present decade, the third of the 21st century, will be decisive when it comes to addressing these issues and planning a little bit better the future of our communities before we plunge into a conjuncture of chaos, confusion, and rising inequalities, even more disturbing than the one that we are currently witnessing under the current pandemic. There are, of course, many people who are denying the relevance of many of these concerns, but even these people cannot really ignore ongoing debates on environmental destruction, climate change, and the future of the planet. These are the biggest challenge of the era we live in, the Anthropocene, or the age of humans. Let me just say a very few quick words about the Anthropocene to make sure that everyone is included in this discussion this evening. The term Anthropocene was coined by the late atmospheric scientist Paul Crutzen in a conference meeting sometime in 2000, in which he referred to the present geological era with the term Anthropocene, or the age of humans, to capture the idea that humans have become one of the most potent geophysical forces in the planet, and their activities are leading to increasing environmental uncertainties. We are now in 2021, and Paul Crutzen died earlier this year. And there is still no consensus within the geophysical sciences on the validity of the term Anthropocene, just as there is no consensus on the precise beginning of the Anthropocene as a geological era. But most scholars would agree that the environmental impact of the human planetary expansion has become increasingly visible after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and in particular, after the great global acceleration that took place after World War II. In the last 2 decades, the term Anthropocene has gained increasing popularity beyond the geophysical sciences, entering the humanities, the social sciences, the arts, and the media, and leading to the development of alternative terms like Capitalocene, for example, or plantation scene, and many others, all of which defined in relation to the original concept of the Anthropocene. Whichever way we look at this concept, the Anthropocene has entered global, cultural, and political imaginaries as some kind of hyper-object or magnet that helps capture the tensions and the dilemmas of the age we live in, an age that is marked by increasing anxieties about the future of human life on the planet. But the Anthropocene is not just a runaway world of environmental doom, it is also about overcoming disaster and catastrophe and creating new visions of hope and justice. The realities of the anthropogenic climate change, species extinction, and sea level compel a reimagining of humanity's place in the world and an urgent rethinking of the dominant forces threatening the ecological balance of the planet. We are living in a high carbon economy that is environmentally unsustainable. And we are going to hear a lot about sustainability this evening, and needs to be radically transformed. Using the term Anthropocene to refer to the current age of increasing anthropogenic environmental uncertainties has certainly started new conversations about what needs to be changed in the current economic system, but it has also generated a monolithic understanding of the Anthropocene as a unified human experience. The framing of the Anthropocene around the universalizing species paradigm has a homogenizing effect that hides significant exclusions and inequalities. Not all humans are equally implicated in the major forces driving contemporary human environmental crises, and not all humans, and hardly any non-humans, are invited into the conceptual spaces where these disasters are theorized or responses to disaster formulated. If we really want to do something to change the current economic system, we need to be capable of developing a more inclusive conversation that includes all human populations, and perhaps even learn from some of these populations how to build an economy that is no longer focused on conquering nature, but on learning how to coexist with the plurality of life forms around us. Pluralizing the Anthropocene will feature 6 talks by major thinkers in the humanities and the sciences, committed to developing a more inclusive and diverse understanding of Anthropocene debates of resilience, adaptation, and the struggle for environmental justice. Every talk will be followed by an informal conversation and a Q&A session with the audience via the chat function. The chat function is currently closed, but it will be open towards the end during the Q&A session. If you would like to ask a question, please prepare your question and have it ready to be posted in the chat box once the Q&A session starts. This talk will be conducted in English, and if you need any language assistance, Microsoft Teams has a subtitle translation function that can be activated by pressing a caption symbol that is usually located in the right bottom corner of the application. A number of languages are available via this functionality, so please feel free to activate it. Please bear in mind that this event is being recorded by Seravs and will be later released for public viewing via social media and the internet. But let me go back to the main reason why we are all here. This was a bit of a long detour. The colloquium will open tonight with a talk by Tim Ingold, and we are truly honored to have him here. His pioneering efforts to integrate anthropological and ecological approaches have inspired many people around the world and will continue to do so for many years. Tim Ingold is without any doubt one of the most famous living social anthropologists. He is Professor Emeritus of Social Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen in the UK, has carried out fieldwork among Sami and Finnish people in Lapland, and has written on environment, technology and social organization in circumpolar north, on animals in human society, and on human ecology and evolutionary theory. His work has explored questions of environmental perception and skilled practice, amongst others, and his current interests lie on the interface between anthropology, archaeology, art, and architecture. He has a vast publication record, too vast for me to mention here in full. Amongst his many books are included, just to give a few examples, The Perception of the Environment, Lines, Being Alive, Making, The Life of Lines, Anthropology and as Education, and Anthropology, Why It Matters, as well as Correspondences, the last one published in 2020. This evening, I think we are in for a treat because Tim will share with us some unpublished material to be included in his next book. Ladies and gentlemen, Tim Ingold, The Sustainability of Everything. Tim, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gonçalo, and for that very generous introduction. Well, this lecture both begins and ends with a conversation. I begin from a conversation with the director of an arts organisation in the northeast of Scotland, here where I live. She was planning an event to celebrate the planting of a new woodland in the area and wanted me to contribute to the event with a talk. So I asked her what topics she had in mind, and her answer was that I should address the theme of sustainability and its bearing on art, on science and ecology, and on citizenship and democracy. You mean you want me to talk about the sustainability of everything? I replied incredulously. And it seemed at the time like an impossible thing to do. And yet the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to me that sustainability is either of everything or it is nothing. It cannot be of some things and not others. It can countenance no boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. So what kind of everything can always surpass itself, always have room for more, without at any moment appearing partial or incomplete? And the answer to which I eventually gravitated, and which I'll elaborate in what follows, is that everything is indeed a conversation. And this conversation, with which I will eventually end this talk, is no more and no less than the world we inhabit. Now, to reach this conclusion and to fulfill the brief that was originally presented to me, I had to pose three subsidiary questions. First, how can we imagine a world that has room for ourselves and for everyone and everything else, both now and for generations to come? Second, what does it mean for such a world to carry on, to keep on going, to be sustained? And third, what can we do to make this happen? And to answer these questions, we need to take a closer look at our two key words, sustainability and everything. Now, I admit that for many, the notion of sustainability may seem to have outlived its worth, to have been devalued by overuse and compromised through its co-option by powerful interests whose overriding concern has been for their own survival in a world of ever more intense competition for dwindling planetary resources. Yet I believe it is a notion that we cannot do without, and that to give up on it would be tantamount to the abandonment of our responsibility towards coming generations. The challenge then is to give meaning to a term that paradoxically combines the idea of an absolute limit with the limitlessness of carrying on forever. Real sustainability, I'll argue, begins at the moment when the doors of perception swing open, when objectivity gives way to the search for truth, or finality to renewal, whereupon what appears from the outside as a limit opens up from within into a space of growth, movement, and transformation, to limitless possibility, or in a word, to everything. And it's with everything that I begin. For those of us educated into the ways of modern science, our inclination is always to conclude with everything rather than to begin from it. And we can reach a conclusion, we think, only by summing things up. That is, we perform an addition. We add and we add numbers of people, numbers of species, numbers of objects of this or that kind, numbers of characters on the page, numbers of stars in the sky, numbers of cells in the body, number of pinhead. We are bamboozled by numbers, many of a magnitude that defy comprehension. They have to be broken off from the processes that gave rise to them, from the life. You must be able to tell where one thing ends and another begins. The world must be rendered discontinuous. However, we soon discover that some things are difficult, if not impossible, to render thus as discrete, enumerable quanta. Try adding up clouds in the sky, waves in the ocean, trees in the wood, fungi. The difficulty is that these things are always forming and dissolving, growing and decomposing, appearing sometimes to merge and at other times to break up. Take clouds, for example. Now, clouds are not discrete objects suspended in the sky. They are rather folds of the sky itself, moisture-laden formations of the turbulent and crumpled mass of atmospheric air. Waves, too, are folds ever forming at the surface where the ocean in its intercourse with the sky is whipped up by the wind. You could perhaps count waves as they wash up on the shore, much as you could count footsteps, breaths, or heartbeats. But what would they amount to? A life, perhaps, with breaths, steps, and heartbeats, all eternity with the waves. Counting would not be adding up a world, but the rhythm of time passing. And with trees and fungi, addition is just as impracticable. Who can say how many trees there are in a wood? Well, true, you could measure up, as foresters do, estimating the number and volume of trunks in the stack where a plot is felled. But in so doing, you have already in your mind's eye cut each and every tree from all that nourishes it and gives it life, from the soil, the fungi that wrap around its roots, the air and the sunlight that fuel its growth. And to count fungi is merely to enumerate the fruiting bodies, ignoring the underground mesh of the mycelium from which they spring. But is it really any different with people? Are people any easier to add up than clouds, waves, trees, and fungi? Can you arrive at everybody by counting heads? Well, in a crude sense, of course you can, as in the taking of a census or a vote, but only by abstracting every head from the living, breathing body of which it is intrinsically a part. Topologically, the body is not a closed container, but an open vessel. Its surface is so intricately enfolded that it is practically impossible to distinguish its interior and exterior regions. Normally, we only see one part of every person, namely the fleshy part. The part we don't see is the breath, the air we inhale and exhale, and without which we couldn't live. Like trees in the wood, people intermingle with one another. They go in and out of each other's bodies, in the beguiling phrase of anthropologist Maurice Bloch, even as they breathe the air. And their voices, carried on the breath and permeating the atmosphere, they mingle also, sometimes joining as in the unison of song, sometimes splitting apart as they lift up over one another without ever separating into discrete sound. You may, through an act of differential attention, be able to tell one voice from another, to split them along the grain of their becoming, but you cannot count them up. So in the polyphony of voices, that is, in the conversation, the collective everyone, like everything, is an intermingling, not a totality arrived at by the addition of its individual elements, but what I shall call a plenum. The plenum is not a space filled up to capacity with things, it is fullness itself. And the things we find there, including clouds, waves, trees, and people, emerge as folds, ever forming by way of the turbulence of lively materials. With the plenum, we do not end with everything, nor strictly speaking do we begin with it. We find ourselves instead wrapped in its midst. Now we have many words to describe the plenum, words like world, cosmos, nature, earth. But does the world contain holes that remain to be filled? Are there gaps in the cosmos, voids in nature, empty spaces in the earth? We might regard a patch of ground as a site on which to build. It must first be cleared of obstructions like trees and boulders. Foundations must be dug, materials gathered and assembled. To clear the ground, however, is not to leave a void, but to smooth it out, as when you remove a crease from a fabric. And to build is not to refill the space, but once again to crease the ground, pressing it into the rising forms of walls and the vault of the roof. Thus, every infill is in reality a reworking, a doubling up that introduces a kink, twist, or knot into the very fabric of the earth. So things that to our senses might appear solid, tangible, and visibly stable, a building here, a tree or a boulder there, even a human being or an animal, each occupying its particular region of space or moment in time, these are truly but the provisional forms or envelopes of incessant movement. So in the plenum, material folds on itself as it goes along. And as it does so, it endlessly overflows any formal envelopes within which it may appear temporarily to have been pulled aside or detained. The plenum, then, is limitless, not because its capacity can always be increased, but because it forever carries on. We do not ask the ocean whether it has room to accommodate a few more waves, nor does the ocean respond like an overbooked hotelier. Oh, unfortunately, we're full up. For the waves are ever forming even as they break upon the shore. So everything in the sense of the plenum is not an ultimate conclusion, not the sum total when all is added up, but pure becoming. Things in their becoming continually differentiate themselves from within the plenum, as do clouds in the sky, or waves in the ocean, or indeed voices in the conversation, without ever parting company from it. You don't tell things apart by superimposing a conceptual grid on the data of experience. You do it by entering into the processes of their formation and by separating them from the inside along the grain. It's a matter of splitting, not cutting. And to get at the difference, compare cutting a log with a saw and splitting it with an axe. In the first case, you impose a system of fixed intervals upon the raw material of timber. And having cut the logs into desired lengths, you can count them up. But in the second case, with the axe, you enter into the grain and follow a line of growth, a line incorporated into the timber when it was part of a living tree growing in the ground. So with cutting, you divide from the outside. With splitting, you differentiate from the inside. Splitting, in short, is a process of what I call interstitial differentiation. For another example of the same distinction, compare walking with surveying. In ancient Egypt, the job of the surveyor, who was known as a rope stretcher, was to measure up and divide the land into plots, following every annual flood of the Nile. He would drive stakes into the ground at fixed points and stretch the rope from one stake to the other in order to determine field boundaries. So every stake is a stoppage, the equivalent of what we would now call a data point. Divides the ground. His feet both follow the trail and in their impression re-inscribe it. Thus the trail or the path is not laid out over the ground, but is formed from within it. So you might be able to tell the path from the ground, but there is no telling the ground from the path. Moreover, turning from walking to writing, we find the same contrast. The handwritten trace emerges from within the texture of the page, where pen meets parchment or paper along a line of movement. But printed words and letters are deposited from above. You can count the number of characters on a printed page, and on screen your laptop can do it automatically at the touch of a button. But there is no way of counting the number of lines on a page of handwriting. So, how can we comprehend everything? Do we collect all the data, count up all the people, survey all the land, add up all the words? Is it a matter of assembling wholes from parts in a nested series of levels in which wholes at one level become parts of wholes at the next level up? Is everything in this sense a vertically integrated totality? Or do we find everything by going along, following every route, runner, trail, and trace? Now the latter implies an entirely different view of part-whole relations, harmonic rather than totalizing, in which coherence arises from the tension of contrary forces and inclinations. The rope, for example, maintains its torsion and does not unwind because the twist of its constituent strands is contrary to the twist of its strands with one another. In polyphonic music, melodic lines likewise answer to each other in counterpoint. And yet, the rope keeps on winding, the music keeps sounding, the waves keep breaking on the shore. The plenum, in short, belongs to time. Perhaps indeed it is time. Everything, in the sense of the plenum, is not an ultimate conclusion, not the sum total when all is added up, but pure concrescence. For in a concrescent world, as the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead taught, everything is perpetually undergoing creation together. Trees growing older together in the wood, people living together in society, their voices carrying on together in conversation. This does not mean, of course, that the plenary world is only half-formed or incomplete, for incompletion can only be judged in relation to a state of finality. In the plenum, by contrast, nothing is final, and every ending is an unfinishing that opens up to fresh beginning. So with this, we return to the question from which I began: how can we imagine a world that is sustainable for everyone and everything, both now and forever? In the plenum, as we found, everything is sustainable because it tends to no limit, but rather opens to a perpetual process of world renewal. Indeed, in redefining everything as a plenum, we have also come close to achieving a workable definition of sustainability. It's a definition, however, that stands in stark contrast to that of mainstream sustainability science. In the currently dominant discourses of science, technology, and commerce, the aim of sustainability is not to open up to the power of world renewal, but to harness or capture this power and to put it to use in the production of so-called renewables. This is to turn beginnings into endings, to turn the transformative power of a living earth into goods and services for present and future human consumption. In the rationale of sustainable development, the world is understood not as a plenum to be inhabited, but as a totality to be managed, much as a company manages its assets by balancing the books, living off interest without eating into capital reserves. Sustainability is thus defined in terms of goals or targets to be achieved along an axis of progressive development. But the sustainability of everything runs counter to this axis. Its commitment is not to progress so much as to the continuity of life. In a study of upland forestry in Japan, the anthropologist John Knight offers a cautionary tale of what can go wrong if the axis of development takes precedence over the axis of continuity. Traditionally, Japanese foresters would look after trees for a generation and then cut them for use as house timbers. And in the house, the timbers enjoy what the foresters called a second life. In this phase, the direction of care is reversed. For where foresters had nurtured trees in their first life, it is now the trees that nurture the foresters and their families in the second by furnishing the warmth, shelter, and comfort of the dwelling. Now, during this time, the foresters are looking after a new generation of growing trees, which will eventually, in their turn, become replacement house timbers. And so it would continue, generation after generation. Here, the lives of foresters and their trees go along together, responding to one another in a cycle of mutual care that, in principle, can continue indefinitely. But today, as Knight shows, the cycle has been broken. Conservationists demand that old trees be preserved and not cut. So these arboreal veterans are hence denied their second life. And the people, left without timbers to replace old ones as they rot, have taken to building their houses out of concrete instead. Development here has trumped continuity. Now, this example reveals a deeply entrenched fault line in ways of thinking about the future. Should it be projected as a steady state or anticipated as an ongoing concrescence? Even if it were possible in theory to balance the ship of the world on its keel, the balance could only be sustained by calming the ocean, putting life and history permanently on hold. The future then could be no more than a protraction of the present. Far from ensuring the continuation of everything, sustainability would shut it down. My argument to the contrary is that to bring sustainability and everything back into line, we need fundamentally to rethink our relation to the world, to the future, to time, and to memory. And with this, we come to the third of the questions with which I began. To recapitulate, in response to the first question, I've shown how a world that has room for everyone and everything for all time must be imagined as a plenum. In response to the second, I've shown that for such a world to carry on, we need to understand sustainability as concrescence, as a process in which persons and things, as they wind along together, bring each other into being in a renewal that knows no end. But the third question asks, what can we do now in our present times to bring about a world fit for coming generations to inhabit? Is it possible, even in principle, let alone in practice, to fashion sustainability by design? Now, on the face of it, this seems like a fruitless endeavor. For if, say, our predecessors had succeeded in designing the future we now inhabit, what would be left for us? We would have nothing to do save to fall in line with their already imposed imperatives. Alternatively, were it to fall to us to shape a future for our successors, then they in turn would become mere users or consumers tied to the implementation of a design already made for them. Design, it seems, must fail if every generation is to look forward to a future that it can call its own. That is, for every generation to begin afresh, to be a new generation. Perhaps the very history of design could be understood as the cumulative record of concerted human efforts to put an end to it, an interminable series of final answers, none of which, in retrospect, turned out to be final after all. Or to adapt a maxim from the environmental pundit Stuart Brand, all designs are predictions, all predictions are wrong. And this hardly sounds like a formula for sustainable living. The sustainability of everything, I've argued, is not about meeting targets. It is about keeping life going. And yet, design based on the science of sustainability seems intent on bringing it to a stop by specifying moments of completion when things fall into line with prior projections. Form is the end, death, insisted the artist Paul Klee in his notebooks. Form giving is movement, action. Form giving is life. So by setting ends to things, do we not, as Klee intimated, kill them off? If design brings predictability and foreclosure to a life process that is inherently open-ended and concrescent, then is it not the very antithesis of life? So how, following Klee's example, might we shift the emphasis in design from form to form giving? How, in other words, can we think of design as part of a process of life whose outstanding characteristic is not that it tends to a limit, but that it carries on? Now, design for the plenum, for the sustainability of everything, if it is to meet this requirement, must be driven not by plans and predictions, but by hope. With plans and predictions, we can be optimistic that their realization is just around the corner, that there is light at the end of the tunnel. But hope and optimism are not the same. The difference is that optimism anticipates final outcomes, hope does not. The verb to hope is not transitive, like to make or to build, but intransitive, like to grow and indeed to live. It denotes a process that does not begin here and end there, but carries on through. So I suggest that in designing for sustainability, in making it happen, we should treat design too as an intransitive verb, as a way of carrying on that is intrinsically open-ended. Ask not then what you are designing, but how. Let me return to Klee, this time to his celebrated creative credo of 1920. Art does not reproduce the visible, but makes visible. It is not for art, Klee contended, to hold a mirror to reality. It is rather to enter into the relations and processes that give rise to things so as to bring them into the field of our awareness. And only so long as these relations and processes carry on, can the world offer a sustainable abode for its inhabitants. Now, I believe we can understand design for sustainability as an art in Klee's sense. Far from setting out to transform the world or to bring it into line with a preconceived plan, it is to enter imaginatively into the process of the world transforming itself, of its autopoiesis. And this process, however, unfolds along not one, but multiple paths. It is, in essence, a conversation. And like life, conversations carry on. They have no particular beginning point or end point. No one knows in advance what will come out of them, nor can their conduct be dictated by any one partner. They are truly collective achievements. So let us then think of designing for sustainability as a conversation, embracing not only human beings, but all the other constituents of the life world, from non-human animals of all sorts to things like trees, rivers, mountains, and the earth. All who join the conversation are contributing, each in their own way, to design for a sustainable world. So let me now return to the challenges put to me in the conversation that originally prompted this talk. In the sustainability of everything, what is there for art to do? What is the relation between art, science, and ecology? And what does our rethinking of sustainability mean for citizenship and democracy? Now, I've argued that sustainability can only be reconciled with everything if we redefine our relation to the world and our place in it. And to do so means acknowledging, with the philosopher of science Karan Barad, that far from standing outside the world and imposing our designs upon it, we are ourselves part of the world in its differential becoming. Now, for science, this is a hard pill to swallow, increasingly hard, as science has sought to immunize itself through the perfection of its instruments and the elaboration of its methodology from what are perceived as distortions arising from any affective involvement of practitioners with the objects of their study. This immunity, however, has also hardened scientists' resistance to the kind of ecological sensibility that would ground their ways of knowing in the habitation of a life world. The goals of today's science, more than ever before, are of modeling, prediction, and control. And it has consequently fallen largely to art to take on the mantle of radical ecological awareness that science has cast aside. Many contemporary environmental artists, along with their colleagues in architecture and design, are indeed leading the way in breaking down the barriers between humanity and nature, foregrounding lived experience, and highlighting the richness and complexity, as well as the mystery and strangeness of a world which human beings have irrevocably altered through their activities, yet in which they remain puny by comparison with the forces they have unleashed. This is not to say that art, in its way of working, is necessarily opposed to science. It is rather to plead for a different way of doing science, different at least from its more arrogant and hubristic versions, by which I mean the kind of big science that in this epoch of the Anthropocene pretends to have the power to fix the planet once and for all. A true science of sustainability, rather than claiming exclusive powers both to explicate the world and to bring it under control, should be more modest, deferential, and above all, more attentive in its ambitions, and should be prepared to admit the things it studies into the field of its own deliberation. In short, for it to join the conversation, science must shed its totalitarian impulses and recognize that its peculiar way of knowing is neither sovereign nor absolute, but one of many. After all, how can we possibly know everything? If the plenum is not closed in but open to infinite differentiation, then the same must be true of our ways of knowing it. They too must go along together and differentiate themselves from one another in the ever-continuing conversations of life. Now, it is usual for scientists to call their ways of knowing research. And in the science of sustainability, as we've seen, research is closely tied to the calculus of renewables. The claim of scientific research that it aims to fill gaps in understanding rests on a logic of addition, on the idea that our knowledge of the world, though currently incomplete, will ultimately add up to a totality. However, for an itinerant practice of research that follows the ways of the world from within, there are no gaps to fill. Indeed, my earlier observation that in the plenum every apparent infill is really a reworking applies with equal force to research. What is research, after all, if not a way of searching again, a second search, which at once doubles up on what went before and is an original intervention in its turn? That's what research literally means, a reworking in which we differentiate emergent phenomena even as we join with them. Experienced thus as a way of knowing, research continually surpasses itself. It's not an addition, but a concrescence. And it is as befitting to art as it is to science. So for what then do we search? The answer, of course, is truth. In a sustainable world, research never ends because it is most fundamentally a search for truth. Without this commitment to truth, research would be cast adrift like a lost spacecraft with no recollection of its mother planet and no clue as to where it's heading. And yet, in this cynical and untrusting age, truth is often considered a dangerous, if not deluded idea, best kept inside scare quotes. For many, the very mention of truth conjures up memories of the tyranny wrought throughout history by those claiming to be its masters and to act as its worldly ambassadors, invariably with calamitous consequences for all concerned. We should not, however, blame truth, for the atrocities committed in its name. The fault lies in its totalization, its conversion into a monolith that stands eternal like a monument, timeless and fully formed. Research, to the contrary, rests on the acknowledgement that we can never master truth, any more than we can conquer life. Such conquest is for immortals. But for us, mortal beings, truth is always greater than we are, always beckoning from beyond the horizons of our present knowledge and understanding. The role of research, then, is to offer an imaginative opening to truth. And yet, by the same token, truth should on no account be confused with fact. The fact stops us in our tracks and blocks our way. This is how it is, it says. Proceed no further. But even if the facts of a case may be incontrovertibly established, its truth lives on. For what appear to us in the first instance as data points or stoppages turn out, when we search again, that is in our research, to be openings that let us in. It is as though the fact rotated by 90 degrees, like a door on opening, so that it no longer confronts us face on, but aligns itself longitudinally with our own movements. And where the fact leads, we follow. Come with us, it says. And what had once put an end to our search then reappears in research as a new beginning, a way into a world that is not already formed, but itself undergoing formation. It is not that we have broken through the surface of the world to discover its hidden secrets. Rather, as the doors of perception open, and as we join with things in the relations and processes of their formation, the surface itself vanishes. The truth of this world, then, is not to be found out there, established by reference to objective facts, but is disclosed from within. It is indeed the very matrix of our existence as worldly beings. We can have no knowledge of this truth, save by being in it. Knowing, in short, unfolds from the inside of being. Now, this conclusion will naturally be anathema to those who hold that true knowledge of the world can be had by. For them, objectivity is of truth. It is indeed understandable that in a world where facts often appear divorced from any kind of observation, where they can be invented on a whim, propagated through mass media and manipulated to suit the interests of the powerful, regardless of their veracity, it's no surprise that we should be anxious about the fate of truth. To many, it seems that in this era of post-truth, we have lost our grip on reality. But while we are right to insist that there can be no proper facts without observation, we are wrong, I believe, to suppose that observation stops at objectivity. For to observe, it is not enough merely to look at things. We have to join with them and to follow. That's what observation means, to follow attentively, whether by watching, listening, or feeling what someone or something else is doing. And it is precisely as observation goes beyond objectification that truth goes beyond the facts. This is the moment in our observations when the things with which we study begin to tell us how to observe. And in allowing ourselves into their presence rather than holding them at arm's length, that is, in attending to them, we find that they are also guiding our attention. Attending to these ways, we also respond to them as they respond to us. Research then becomes a practice of correspondence and of care. It's a labor of love, giving back what we owe to the world for our own existence as beings within it. So finally, What does all this mean for democracy and citizenship? It cannot, for one thing, mean democracy in the sense of a head count, which sorts everyone into those with common or opposed interests. In a sustainable democracy, one with room for everyone and everything now and forever, people cannot be counted, and nor can things. And yet in their conjoint action and affective correspondence, they constitute a public. As Jane Bennett writes after John Dewey, publics are groups of bodies with the capacity to affect and be affected. Whether human or non-human, these are bodies in conversation, bodies whose presence is felt by way of their voices as they mix and mingle in the medium. In the democratic conversation, each has something to give, something to contribute, precisely because they are all different. Together, they comprise what the philosopher Alfonso Linguis, in an apt turn of phrase, calls the community of those who have nothing in common. And the meaning of citizenship follows from this. It is about learning to live together in difference. For within a democratic community that is open-ended and unbounded, rather than closed in the defense of common interests, citizenship arises not as a right or entitlement given from the start, but as something you have to work at. This is the work of commoning, not the discovery of what you have in common to begin with, but the imaginative act of casting your experience forward a long ways joined with others in carrying on a life together. Only then can citizenship be truly sustainable. The road to sustainability, in short, lies in the conversations of life. Imagining the world as a plenum, I believe, affords a way of thinking about democracy and citizenship that could give hope to future generations. At the present juncture, however, this way of thinking has been pushed to the margins, above all by the relentless expansion of big science, aided and abetted by state actors and multinational corporations. And with them has gone the question from which all inquiry must begin. How ought we to live? Big science is not interested in this question because it believes it can already deliver the answer, or if not already, then in the future within its sights. But it has no answer for what lies beyond its predictive horizons. When the dinosaurs went extinct, it was the small mammals that inherited the earth, among them the weasel. The most famous weasel in history could turn out to be the one that bit through an electric cable, putting the largest machine ever built, CERN's Large Hadron Collider, out of action for a week. The collider is perhaps the greatest expression of scientific hubris we have seen, dedicated as it is to discovering the final truth of the universe, one that will leave us mortals with no place to be. It is the delusional project of our time, truly a machine for the end of the world. But the eventual collapse of big science, which is no less inevitable than the collapse of the global economy that sustains it, will not bring the world to an end. It will instead inaugurate a new beginning. A time will come beyond the Anthropocene, and for that, our weaselly hero gave its life, and we must ensure the sacrifice was not in vain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. That was a wonderful talk. As I heard it and read it, to me was a very important defense of the notion of sustainability, which is probably no longer as in fashion as it used to be some decades ago. I think you point that out as well in your paper. It was very rich conceptually, and I am sure that we could spend hours talking about the various conceptual subtleties and nuances of the paper. But I know that many in the audience may not be familiar with some of the some of the concepts that you mentioned. So perhaps I would like to invite you to help me unpack a bit the practical implications of some of the ideas that you are discussing so beautifully in your presentation. I mean, one question that I had is about the very notion of sustainability that you have. I mean, you make a strong case as to why we should hold on to the notion of sustainability. It's a concept that has been devalued, as I said earlier. It's probably overused and if not misused by corporations, national governments, international organizations that have other interests in mind other than sustainability itself. But you argue that we cannot really do without the notion of sustainability, and that to give up on it would be, very much like abandoning our responsibility towards the future generations. So instead of abandoning the concept altogether, what you have done this evening is to kind of try to reconceptualize it and to start imagining how to put it to practice. So in your view, sustainability, it's about carrying life. So it's not about achieving a certain state or a steady state. It has to involve everything. It has to involve everyone. It's sustainability of everything. And you draw a contrast between this sustainability of everything and everyone with pre-existing notions or more hegemonic notions of sustainability based on what you call the science of sustainability and the production of renewables. Could you give some more practical examples? I mean, you give some examples in your talk, especially of the sustainability of everything, with the wonderful example taken from John Knight's Japanese ethnography. But what do you mean by science of sustainability, for example? Is the Paris Agreement on climate change an example of an institution based on the science of sustainability?
I suppose it is. I mean, there is such a thing as the science of sustainability, and it has its own journals and body of very substantial body of literature. So there are a whole body of there's a large number of scientists out there who would identify themselves as sustainability scientists, and they're working on these particular issues. It usually involves all kinds of measurements of the kinds of measurements that we read about all the time. That we were just hearing about from Bill Gates launching his new book. How much carbon we're releasing into the atmosphere, how much this, how much that. What value should we attach to so-called ecological services, and all of these sorts of things, which tend to be debated within a framework of economics. What I want to do by recast, I agree. I don't think we should. I don't think we can afford to abandon the concept of sustainability. We have rather to come up with a better notion of what it is. And what I want to do is to try and show how all sorts of everyday actions, which all of us do in our daily lives, in caring for other people, caring for our gardens, caring for our kin, caring for our houses, all of these little things can in fact be understood as forms of sustainable action. So if we think of sustainability as a process of carrying life on, a process that is geared to the imperative of the continuity of life, then when a mother cares for her child by love, by feeding, by providing a domestic environment and so on, that is those little acts of love and care are acts of sustainability. When we cook meals, they're acts of sustainability. There are all kinds of things that people do in everyday life, and they're being told by science that they should do things differently, that they're not sustainable and so on. What we need to show is that all sorts of little things that we do, by which we care for one another and care for the world around us, that these are important and these are valuable and that they contribute to the sustainability of life and of the world that we're living in. So I want all those little things, the ordinary things that people do and the things they know. I want people to realize and to feel that, yes, these things are important and they're part of the way in which we can make a world for coming generations, instead of them being dismissed as just kind of common activities of ordinary people that don't count.
Yes. And you seem to be at some point in your presentation you were talking about the challenge, or you seem to be against the idea that the sustainability of everything can be imposed by design. So instead of thinking about this new vision as something that can be implemented, as if we are standing outside the world, from the top to the bottom, right? You rather think as something that has to come from within.
Yes,
it has to come from within. But do you conceive? Is it possible to have institutions, macro level institutions, to support these everyday life practices that you are talking about, and to amplify the significance of the sustainability of everything as a vision?
You can have macro level institutions if these are facilitative institutions and not prescriptive, controlling ones. I think that a large part of the problem comes from the ways in which the institutions where power is concentrated have got bigger and bigger and bigger, and in them power is becoming more and more and more concentrated. We're not going to find a final, nobody wants a final solution to the world's problems. That would be the end of all of us. We have to accept and admit that we'll just keep on muddling along. And then you think, well, if you've got a world that is just muddling along, so long as it's still muddling along, that's fine. It's still going on, the show is still on the road. Then can we best achieve that by having some kind of enormous central directing agencies that are telling everybody what to do, or by allowing people who know each other and the world, the environment in which they live, who know it best, to manage their own affairs? And on the whole, my feeling is that the more we can delegate ethical, moral, and practical responsibility to the people who actually know what they're doing on the ground, living in those lands or fishing those oceans, the better the hope for a continuity of life. So if we're going to have big institutions on a kind of United Nations scale, which we probably need, just as we need the United Nations, we need institutions like that. But their job is to provide a framework within which people can carry on with their lives. Their job is not to dictate or to take over from those people the responsibility for looking after their lands and waters and so on.
I'm sure you are aware that you are going a little bit against the grain, given that in the current pandemic, what we've witnessed in the last year or so is precisely the opposite. What we're seeing is states and sort of international organizations precisely not being willing to kind of delegate that capacity of self-organization in the life, in society, and to argue that they have to intervene and to impose, top-down restrictions in order to minimize the effects of the pandemic. So would that be an example of something not to do, or?
Well, we do have a perfect example of this here in the UK. You've probably heard about it. When the government first started to introduce a track and trace system to deal with the COVID pandemic, they insisted on centralizing it and delegating it to a private company that was then tasked with producing a nationwide system. And it was complete failure. And everybody was saying, please, please allow local authorities, that is cities, regions, local areas, to manage their own track and trace systems, because they have the people who know the area, know the people. Even sometimes the question being able to speak the languages in terms when we're dealing with ethnic minorities of various kinds. And in many cases, actually what happened was that without the resources, because the government didn't provide them, those local authorities just got on with it themselves. And their results were spectacular, whereas the national results were just completely hopeless. So when it comes to imposing a lockdown or something like that, then we do need to have a legal framework within which people operate. But that has to be the framework within which as much responsibility is delegated locally as possible.
Yes,
that's what's happened in Scotland. We've had, and it's been much more successful.
No, it happened exactly something similar. I recall during, soon after the Fukushima disaster in Japan, and basically the government was trying to impose certain readings of toxic levels of radioactivity in food, and basically the population was, stopped trusting the data that was being imposed from the top, and set up their own local stations to disseminate information on levels of radioactivity, and basically everybody became some kind of family scientist, buying their own Geiger counter and so on and so forth. So yes, there are limits on top-down impositions. One of the things that you don't mention, it's a word sort of that I think you don't mention in your presentation, and I was kind of curious to hear you talk a little bit about it, is capitalism, because of course capitalism is one of the things that is behind the current economic system as we know it today. It's a particular form of capitalism, of course. It's a late modern form of capitalism. But within Anthropocene studies, there are debates about, whether to call it Anthropocene, for example, or Capitalocene. I mean, Jason Moore, for example, has pushed for Capitalocene because basically the history of anthropogenic environmental uncertainties, the recent history is very much a product of this system that we call capitalism. So I suppose my question is the sustainability of everything compatible with capitalism as we know it today, or we have to undermine the system.
It's not compatible with capitalism. I mean, no doubt that I think what we're seeing, I'm forgetting about COVID for now, forgetting all about the pandemic. Imagine we're it was a year ago or something, we're having this conversation, and the pandemic wasn't yet on the horizon. I would be saying that with all the other turbulences in the world, what we are seeing is the collapse of neoliberalism, and that collapse brings in train, for example, murderous right-wing regimes, Trump-like figures, and so on, and Bolsonaro types. So one can understand this as all symptomatic of manifestly unsustainable neoliberal regime collapsing. And the problem is that no one has a credible alternative for it, and nor could anybody impose it. So whatever the alternative is going to be have to be something that emerges to some extent sui generis of its own accord, and we don't yet know what it's going to be. But something will, and it will, for example, be a system where, for example, part of my vision for the future is one where, for example, agriculture and architecture come together, and it is assumed that buildings are places where people grow food, as well as where people dwell and work. That will then cut down, means that people will start producing food within their own localities, maybe partly themselves. Long supply chains will break down, or end. That's got to be part of the future. So there's some things like that that have to happen, and that we can help them along, or by say getting architecture and agricultural training to join together. There are practical ways in which we can do that, and so the economic relations of the future will not be capitalist relations. They won't be, least of all, of a neoliberal kind. But nobody can tell, nor will they be some kind of socialist experiment. Nobody can tell exactly what they're going to be, and there might be a lot of chaos until we get to anything that looks at all coherent. But I think we are at that stage. I also think that these debates about shall we call it Anthropocene, shall we call it Capitalism, are just silly. I really get quite annoyed with academics who are jousting, having little tournaments about which term is better than that one. They all have their advantages and disadvantages, but multiplying different kinds of scene, using the geological model, is, I think, a pathetic game where issues actually are so serious.
Yeah. You make a touching defense of truth in your paper. I was very touched by it, actually, and also of science in many ways. But you are very critical of big science. You are very critical of scientific hubris, and you seem to make the case that, to some extent, that for China, for science to join the conversation in the plenum that you are describing, it must shed its totalitarian impulses and recognize that it's just one way of, producing knowledge that is not sovereign, and it's just one amongst many others. So I suppose the challenge is, how do we get big science to come this way?
I think I want to make a clear distinction between big science and scientists.
Yes,
I have no problem at all with scientists. They're all so very different sorts of people, just like the rest of us. And some are really nice, and some aren't, and just like it's the same as any other bunch of people. But the problem is not with scientists. Most scientists are absolutely dedicated to whatever they're studying. They are not hubristic at all. They're often very modest people, and very much aware all the time of the limitations of their knowledge, and very attentive to whatever they're studying. They're very skilled. So I don't have any problem with scientists. The problem is the way in which science itself has become, or allowed itself to become, institutionalized and linked in that way to the agendas of state actors and corporations. And I know from conversations that many scientists themselves are intensely frustrated by the institutional framework in which they have to operate, a framework that determines funding and publication, what you're allowed to put in a paper and what you're not, for example. They find this very frustrating. And so I do think it's possible to reform science from within, with the full collaboration of our scientific colleagues, who are, I think, feeling exactly the same frustration with big science that I would.
Yeah, science today, more than ever before, is about modeling, prediction, and control, you say.
Yes.
And to some extent, you suggest that it has fallen to the realm of art and architecture, for example, to take on the task of radical, starting radical ecological awareness. Could you give some examples of what you mean by this? This is also a question that is being asked by members of the audience, who really enjoyed your talk and are asking whether you could recommend some environmental artists and architects whose work we could look into for inspirations and imaginations for our futures.
Oh, I hesitate to do that because there are a lot. Some of them are very famous and some of them are not. But around, there's a tremendous proliferation now in the field of art, of artists who, in one way or another, are becoming they're becoming almost ecological activists. And their art, it becomes itself, it's often performative, and it becomes itself a form of activism that involves collaboration, often with local people, with scientists, and bringing people together around a particular issue. And I just couldn't start listing them all because it would just become a kind of name dropping thing. I'd rather not do that. But what has struck me, because I've had quite a lot of correspondences with a number of artists working in this area. What has struck me is that they are the people who are addressing the deep ecological questions of what does it actually mean to inhabit a world with which includes not just other humans but all sorts of other beings as well, and this is which has traditionally been, well, it's been sort of off limits so far as the natural sciences are concerned. But the important thing is that science itself has changed. I think over the past 50 years, science itself has changed enormously, and it's over that time that it's become more and more attached to the global knowledge economy through its funding, through its institutions, through its publication, and so on. And so, if you remember back in the 1960s, the heyday of field ecology, there'd be ecologists there who had actually loved spending most of their time in the field, get to know the animals or the plants that they were studying really well. They were really doing pretty much what ecological artists are doing now. But nowadays, though, that sort of ecology, of the sort that was being pioneered by field ecologists in the 1960s, is regarded as amateur, almost. Certainly soft, not worthy of respect, not properly data-driven, and so on. Too qualitative. So I think we need to roll back and say, actually, there were ways in which science was being done earlier in its history, which are worth recuperating.
Another question from the audience is about sustainability and design. I'm going to read from Masha Guganig. Many thanks for your insightful talk. You talked about design for sustainability as an area that ought to be an open conversation, as a process of hope. How would you consider applying this ethos of sustainability of everything in policy, where politicians won't listen to anyone without concrete goals and measures? What would a policy of sustainability of everything look like?
That's a really tough one. I know because getting across to into the policy world is the most impossible thing, and I found myself in little bits I've been involved with in terms of environmental policy here in Scotland, that the policy makers themselves are extremely sympathetic and often get it in terms of what I or colleagues might be wanting to say, but then are completely constrained by the framework in which they are required to operate, which is one usually quantitative, positivistic, defined in terms of goals and targets and so on. And I think I'm really not sure how to deal with it. It's a problem, but I think we have to think again about what policy and policy making actually means. I think we've tended to assume a degree of prescriptiveness to policy, which is perhaps not really what even policymakers are looking for. Again, the point about policy is not actually to determine exactly what should happen on the ground or to prescribe certain modes of behavior. I think what policymakers are really trying to do is steer things in what they hope to be a sensible direction. How can one steer a process this way or that way? And if we think, if we start thinking about policy, again, not in terms of laying down markers, stoppages, but think of it more in terms of how can we steer a process which doesn't have a necessary end to it, but we want it to go this way rather than that way. Then that's the way to do it. But we do need to think again, and I think a lot of people in the policy world are thinking about how can they imagine what policy is in a way that is more flexible.
Okay, we have another question from Anna Daniela, more or less similar. I'm not sure if you already answered it. How can people really follow in their daily acts what they perceive inside of their being when a lot of power and resources are concentrated in the hands of small numbers of owners? How can you steer those who own power and resources in the current system to dissolve their grip and let the people act in the ways you describe, or to be willing to facilitate that?
Well, if we knew the answer to that, life would be easy for everybody. But I don't know the answer to this. The only answer that we've ever had is various forms of activism. One has to campaign. What else can we do? However, there is one thing that I'd like to mention, and that is, it's to do with the relations between generations. One of the curious things about the kind of social setup that we have nowadays is that everything is being done by what I call the intermediate generation, the generation of now. That is people from adults to retirement age. Children are not supposed to be in the business of making the world, because they're supposed to be learning how it is and are still ignorant. Old people are supposed to have been past it. Now they've had their turn and should retire. So both the very young and the very old are excluded from the process of making a future. And I think we need to bring them back together again, because throughout most of history, that's what happened. The young kids would learn from their grandparents, and they would be doing things together and making a world together that way. And I think it is tragic that our children are being excluded from the project of making a future world, and at the same time excluded from being able to build that world with the old people who have a lot of experience to share. And we need to bring those generations back together. And I think that would actually help even deal with this problem of how to break down the monopoly power of large owners.
Okay,
of course, getting rid of capitalism would also help.
We have another question from Rui, who asks you if you know about resilience theory and panarchy, because your argument seems to be fairly similar to resilience theory and panarchy, or there are some overlaps. Would you like to comment on that?
I don't know. The word resilience is always been bandied about as one of a triad of words. What is it? Adaptation, vulnerability, and resilience. And these words come out of systems engineering and have been applied to people around the world as to how they're supposed to deal with climate change. And I think it's terrible. So I don't know whether the resilience theory is something separate from that, but I'm a bit suspicious of the word because of the way it's linked to notions of adaptation and vulnerability.
Okay. Another question about cities and professionals engaged in the process of greening the urban space, or in other words, trying to build more sustainable cities. Do you think this is possible at all? Is it possible to apply ideas that you have developed here about the sustainability of everything in efforts by I suppose urbanists to green?
Yes, I think there is, and I mentioned it in passing earlier on, that we must reconceive cities as places where you produce food, and so greening a city is not, it's not enough to green the city by making lots of lovely parks, or although it's nice to have lovely parks and so on, and have planting trees, and that's all fine, but you've got to turn cities into places where people can obtain, without having to travel any great distance, most of what they need to live. And that means most particularly food, but it also means that we could go back to greater role for artisans and craftspeople in making the kind of stuff that we need in our everyday lives. So that's the key route to making cities sustainable. It's about food citizenship.
Juan Miguel asks a question about sustainability, whether it's only about the ecological. If we are talking about the sustainability of everything, should discussions on sustainability go beyond the ecological? Should we include discourses of care? Should we talk about the power of sustainability inherent to the mental field? Should the inner field of the intermingled individuals be part of our takings on the sustainability of everything?
Now, the answer to all those questions is yes. We can either say we need to go beyond ecology, or we can expand the idea of ecology to include all these other things as well. But I think it's absolutely, we cannot limit. In fact, it's probably one of the problems with the way in which sustainability and sustainability science has been done up to now, has been that it has restricted itself too much to the ecological, and that in particular has set up this dialectic between the ecological and the economic, and I sometimes think that actually the real ghost in the machine, the real bug in the system that we have to deal with, it's not big science, it's economics.
It's the economics, yes.
And we really have to get a handle on the extent to which a certain kind of economic thinking has got its claws into so many other fields, and the results of that have been very, very, very problematic, destructive, I would say, and so that's really perhaps, and I haven't talked about economics, but I think really it's that we have to get to grips with, to get the cancer of economics out of all this other stuff that it infects.
Yes. One question about scientific hubris. Can we assume that scientific hubris is somehow on the origin of the recent distanciation between society and science? If so, how can science regain the trust of the common people?
I mean,
it's very difficult questions.
It's a plea for small science and amateur science and the rest of it.
Science,
yes. And citizen science. And lots and lots of working scientists, professional scientists, would love to do that. The problem is that over several decades, and I remember that I was worrying about this when I was a student in the late 1960s, in the height of the Vietnam War, and there was this big movement for social responsibility in science, and because of the perception, which was fairly accurate, that science had simply sold itself to the military-industrial complex, that science was behind the bombing in Vietnam, that it was behind goodness knows what, and atom bomb testing, and that people were so, my generation of what were then student scientists were outraged by the way in which science had allowed itself, and this means its funding and its institutions and its research processes, allowed itself to be basically dictated to by largely, particularly military interests. The amount of funding for science, for example, that was coming through defense budgets was at that time scary, and so it's no wonder that people are mistrustful of science, and to get that trust back, we must stop fetishizing science.
Yes.
As this big thing. It's actually not one thing at all, but a huge number of different things, people, actual scientists working on problems, trying to figure things out, making observations, trying to understand some bit of the world better. And we just need to get back down to that ordinary life of the workaday scientist as a perfectly decent human being trying to do good in the world and rebuild from there. But it's really difficult because science has allowed itself to be largely taken over by these huge multinational and military interests. And it's been a disaster for science, really.
Thank you very much, Tim. I think we are already well past our time.
Yes.
This has been a very rich discussion at all levels, conceptual, practical. I'm sure that everyone has learned a lot. I have personally found the discussion very, very enriching. And one thing that stuck to my mind is that if we want to change the way the current economy works, the current high carbon economy works, it's not enough to be a bit of patchwork here and there and talk about renewables. I mean, we have to talk about a more fundamental conceptual change. We have to talk about the sustainability of everything, not just of a few things and a few human populations. We have to talk about the sustainability of everything. Please join me in thanking Tim Ingold for the pleasure of his company and for sharing his reflections on the challenges ahead in the age of the Anthropocene. Before you go, let me just remind you that the next session of Pluralizing the Anthropocene will take place on March 1st, and we will be talking to another distinguished guest, Anit Singh from the University of California, Santa Cruz, about her new online collaborative project, the Feral Atlas, and how it can help us develop a more pluralized understanding of contemporary Anthropocenic landscapes. The event is free, of course, but registration is required. Please check the Serralva's website for more details on how to register. Thank you once again, and see you on March 1st. You are also invited, Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh.